here in my screen. Okay, this is it. Okay, so again, we are in this last chapter, the case studies, best practices. So I will start with the lower scale, since I see that maybe this is what you need the most. The more local scale, there are two other reflections are at territorial scale and city scale, but given the the space and the time we have for this course, I decided to go to the more specific and the part that you maybe can benefit more from, which is this neighborhood scale, right? And I will show you, just as a first introduction to the topic, I will show you this. This is the map of Catalonia. Maybe you know Catalonia is an autonomous region in Spain, 7.5 million inhabitants. So the size a little bit smaller than Sweden, but bigger than other countries in Europe, the Baltic republics, or Finland, or Norway, or Denmark, or even Belgium, and well, this kind of size. Very small country in terms of surface area, but very dense and populated, and with many problems from the architectural planning, social standpoint, as everywhere else, I would say. During the first decade of the 21st century, there was a big discussion, very proper discussion about housing, access to housing, right? Housing prices were skyrocketing at the time, and the provision of affordable housing for middle class was a big issue. Young people couldn't afford buying a flat, or even renting was very, very expensive, very costly, and young generations needed to move away from cities to the surroundings, to the suburbs, to the peripheries of cities where housing was more affordable. But even though that was not enough, so there was a big gap between a super rapid economic development of the country at that time. Gross national product was growing very rapidly, but even though this kind of wealth was not enough and not sufficiently distributed among classes in order for people to access a proper home, right? So in that kind of context, the regional government of Catalonia promoted a very strong housing, very clear housing policy nationwide, which had three different axes. The first one was the so-called strategic residential areas, is what you see here. Up to 90 areas for housing development were identified across the country in order to build 90,000 new housing units. Half of them planned to be public housing, right? The idea behind that, and this is a discussion maybe I cannot develop extensively here, but just for you to know, the idea behind that is that for every development, half of it should be public housing, meaning public housing, limited price, right? And that's how public housing works in Spain in general, right? Developers get subsidies from the state in exchange for limited selling price, right? That's the idea of public housing. That doesn't mean that the housing stock is owned by public administration. Housing stock, public housing, social, let's say, social housing stock is not owned by authorities. It's subsidized. And that makes a big difference in relation with other countries. And all this policy was based on the idea that the market was so strong, so solid and robust, that every single development could afford to have half of its housing stock with a limited price, so that the other half could compensate that provision of social housing. That's the first axis, what you see on the screen on the left side right? And then there were two super big operations, new housing developments, which were located in, let's say, medium-sized cities, right? Being the first one of it, we will see in detail, but the big numbers is that this area here, it's 200 hectares development. We will see it in detail. It's very close to Barcelona. Actually, it's a continuum, an urban continuum with the city of Barcelona. And there will be a provision of 6,000 housing units in this area, right? All of a sudden, boom, on the market. And in very close vicinity to the city of Barcelona. And then the other one, kind of same scheme, this city here, there was also an extension in the northern part. So both operations were are quite similar in terms of, the relation with the existing urban fabric. And in this case, there was a provision of new between 3,000 and 4,000 housing units, PAM, right? So the idea is that this new big provision or large provision of housing units into the market could alleviate the urgent lack of housing offer into the market, right? So these were the three axes. This was a kind of national plan, and these two were organized in the form of international competitions, right? Offices from all over the planet were invited to partake here, and they submitted their proposals in the first phase, and then they were selected, 10 teams for each proposal, right? And there was a second phase where proposals were developed in more detail. At that time, I was 100% on leading my office at the moment, and luckily enough, we were selected for the three of them. We were the only office partaking in the three initiatives. So we have proposals for the three initiatives. And what I would like to explain to you today is these two, our proposals for these two new housing developments that happened in between 2012 2013, right? That was the timeline for this proposal. So let's start with the first one. This is the city of El Prat del Llobregat. If you go to Google, you will see that the city of Barcelona, this is the river. If you remember, we discussed about it when I showed you the Naturban plan, that idea of renaturalization of the city of Barcelona. Barcelona is constrained geographically very clearly by four elements: the seafront, the mountains, the back of the city, and then two rivers, east and west, right? So this is the western river, the Rio Besós. So the city of Barcelona is here, and just at the other side of the city, there is this medium-sized city. I think it's around 100,000 inhabitants today. And the airport is exactly here. So if you land to Barcelona and go there for tourism, you will land here, take this route or the train, and you will, after 15 minutes, you will step down into the very city center of Barcelona, right? So it's a very, congested, I could say, dense, vibrant metropolitan context, right? Very close to the city center. So the competition was about the extension of this medium-sized city, which is an independent municipality from the legal standpoint, but it's, as I said, an urban continuum with the city of Barcelona. And the idea was to extend the city into this area that I'm marking here, right? It's 200 hectares in a super delicate, from the environmental standpoint view, site, right? So it's a delta. This river, over thousands of years, has been sedimenting here some materials, clay, and this kind of thing. So this delta here is very delicate from the hydrological standpoint, but also from the, environmental biodiversity, and most of the local food that it's consumed today in the city of Barcelona is produced in this agro park here, right? So it's a very delicate location, right? On the other hand, there is a very strong anthropic layer here, plenty of railway tracks, motorways, industries. The first shopping mall, was built here in this particular area. Today is abandoned, but it was, very, reference point into the metropolitan area. It was built in the late 70s. So a lot of things, a lot of stuff happening here. And the harbor, the industrial harbor of the city, is located somewhere here also, very close to the area. So a lot of, traffic, goods being transported across this area, environmental issues, hydrological issues. So a lot of complexity here. So what we thought when we were first commissioned with this challenge here is how to disclose this complexity. And we tend to do that in our office by tracing back the history of the site. We tend to think that proposals, they don't only need to be contextualized in terms of space, but also being contextualized, they need to be contextualized also in terms of time. Urban planning is very much about contributing to a long-term timeline. There has been information on history before us, and then there will be a development in the future after us, after your intervention. So having that in mind, we need to understand how this timeline has been constructed and how we envision our proposal embedded in the future timeline of that particular site. So what we started to do is to analyze what was the, the vocation, the role of that particular area in this wide metropolitan context a long time. And we started doing that by redrawing what was the role. The area is located here, right, in previous time. This is how the image or how the context looks like today. As I was mentioning to you, this is the city of Barcelona, the more, understandable footprint of the city. This is the old town, the medieval town. This is the extension of the 19th century. If you remember what we discussed on Friday, this was the extension, the grid over the so-called plain of Barcelona. This is kind of flat territory. The mountain starts here. This is the river, right? And the city center today is this one, even though the city council is, starting to think to move the city center, this symbolic city center, to this new symbolic city center where the Akbar building by Jean Nouvel is located today, right? So there was this road here, as you can see, a very straight avenue, which is called Gran Via. And if you look not only at this scale, at this metropolitan scale, but if you look at this road in a, I could say even European scale standpoint, you will understand that this is the main street for the whole, at least Western Mediterranean shore in Europe. It stretches from southern Spain to northern Italy. Even it's a kind of parallel road, parallel to the shore, to the seashore road that stretches all these, let's say, 1,000 kilometers, something like that, and it's linking the most important cities all along the Mediterranean coast, from Valencia or even Malaga to Liguria in Italy, right? And it runs all along the Mediterranean Spanish coast, right? And it crosses just through the middle of the city of Barcelona, right? And then continues down. And in pre-industrial times, it was a road that was connecting the city of Barcelona with the city of El Prat, where the new location is located, and then down to the seashore. Actually, when I was mentioning to you that in my childhood, we went to the beach by car, 30 kilometers from the city of Barcelona, we took this road. And then you end up somewhere here. to the other municipalities very close to the seashore. So that was a kind of logic, right? And then there is another one, which is very interesting, which is these former medieval villages that were located just on the slopes of these mountains, right? The geography of Catalonia is a kind of, is very clear, is formed by this, seashore, and let's say something between 5-10 kilometers, there is a mountain range that runs parallel to the seashore, right? And there are some openings through which the river is running, this river and some other rivers, but it can be fairly said that there are two parallel lines, the seashore and the mountain range, right? Exactly on the slopes where this mountain range is meeting the plain, the delta, you can see here the delta very clearly with this agricultural plotting system and this hydrological system. The villages were built during pre-industrial times. Why is that? These villages were built exactly here in order not to step on the productive land. The villages, they had the livestock, their economy was based on agriculture, so it makes no sense to build urban fabric, to build new villages on top of this delta area, because this was the basis of the economy, right? And all these villages, all these little towns, they were connected by the so-called medieval King's Road, right? This road here connecting all these villages and establishing this kind of connection among them so that they could trade and they could connect each other, and they conform kind of system of villages, right? And there was a very weak connection between this super important road, which, by the way, was built by the Romans during the Roman Empire times, right? It's the Via Augusta, with this King's Road, right? There was this very weak connection, this road here, and there was a canal, a water canal, right? That was running from the mountain range, the evacuation of the rainfall coming from the mountain range to the delta. This was a very important element, and then the river, right? This was anthropic, this was natural. So this is how the system looked like in pre-industrial times. And then it came the railway, right? Which is this line here, that you can see, right? That was connecting, the city of Barcelona, El Prat, and then this, collection or this system of all villages built in these areas along the centuries. Okay, then it comes the industrial period, fossil fuel economies. Train is not anymore the main transport connection. Private car becomes dominant, and of course, animal truck transport was abandoned. So motorways took on, and you can see here how this very weak connection between these two roads is becoming more and more complex. Some traffic hubs are appearing, taking a lot of land because they need, for engineering reasons and traffic-oriented reasons, they need to build this kind of spaghetti hubs and roundabouts and all these kind of connections. So it became very, very land consuming, this new infrastructure, and this area, which was preserved, becomes splitted and transformed and impacted by these big motorways. And all along this road, new nodes for connection are appearing, based on this idea of providing access from this motorway to the urban fabric around it, right? So this is, and then something quite interesting is the appearance of new industrial neighborhoods, industrial districts. The economy has changed. It's not agriculture anymore, so it's much more profitable to manufacture here than to grow vegetables, let's say. So you can see very clearly here how at the other side of this King's Road, new industrial districts are appearing. You can even identify them with different colors because the roofs of these buildings are quite different, are other materials. They are not ceramic anymore. They are, fibro cement and this kind of stuff, metal and so on. You can see by color, but also by the grid, the geometry, the fabric, the grain. The urban grain of these neighborhoods or these urban developments are very different. No residents here. Again, something we have already discussed, this zoning logic and this specialization and so on. So you can see very clear how on one side there is residence, on the other there is production, right? Manufacturing, with some exceptions like this one here. But in general terms, this is the new extension of the city here, right? Which in contrast very much with what is intended for this area here. So the program for this area is housing, but also tertiary uses, research and development economy, right? Since we in Europe, we are not manufacturing, at least until very recently, the economy was based on this idea of added value economy. So 6,000 housing units, 300,000 square meters for offices, research companies, and so on, right? So it's mixed development, right? Something important to mention here is that after this first connection, there was in the second phase of this post-industrial development, the construction of a new motorway. This one here, right? This one here. It was built during the 90s of the last century. And something very important is that the entrance from the territorial system to these villages did not happen anymore from this road, but from this one. And you can see here these nodes, these hubs, that are becoming the new entrance to these villages here. So the whole logic, the whole anthropic logic of the system has changed dramatically in terms also of speed. The driving speed, let's say here it's 50 kilometers per hour, here it's 120, right? So even the perception of the space is super different, right? And the space required for this system to work is quite bigger, right? And so there is a change of a scale, a change in the mindset, in the understanding of the space by residents and inhabitants of this city. So what to do with this, right? We are in this kind of system. So our proposal was to somehow reinforce. You can see here our first, draft or scheme for this area. So the idea was to extend this motorway, make it cross through our site in a very urban oriented standpoint, not so much in the heavy traffic transportation of goods and so on, but on surface with no big transportation hubs or nodes, but very adapted to the urban environment in the shape of a boulevard or an avenue. Yeah? And from there, try to reinforce, and this is our vision for the future, right? To reinforce this connection again in a very urban character, right? Today, this motorway is kind of flyover, highways going through without touching the ground, without having any kind of relation with the existing context. But what we envision here is touching the ground, street, Metropolitan Avenue. That's the concept that we coined for our proposal, and then to recover back this idea of urban movement, urban experience of the city, rather than car experience or metropolitan speed experience of the city. So the idea was to reinforce and to shift from these two more or less segregated territorial infrastructures to this integrated super big metropolitan avenue, urban avenue, right? And we discovered also, this is the main idea, right? To build or to reinforce this kind of metropolitan spine for this set or system of urban environments all along these infrastructures, right? And we discovered by analyzing this element or this potential new structure, there was a kind of logic, a kind of sequence, a kind of DNA, how this not motorway, this avenue, this boulevard could work. We were building upon this idea of nodes that were, placed in a sequence of, let's say, something between 1,000, 2,000 meters, 1 to 2 kilometers among them. It's these kind of episodes, right? That today, after some time, they are becoming kind of urban condensers, right? Significant buildings, either commercial or institutional. The city council is located in some of these in one of these nodes. Commercial centers, offices, also residential areas, but quite dense elements that emerge over the rest of the fabric and are becoming kind of significant landmarks in this metropolis, right? So having that in the very dense context of the city of Barcelona, but also in those areas or in those former villages, some of these centers are already established or they were under development during the time of this competition. So we decided that something similar should happen here. So the main proposal, is designed around this axis, I mean the crossing of this metropolitan avenue, and the creation of some significant elements, more dense, more symbolic, in terms of both visual understanding of the city, but also location of new activities, right? So this is the kind of, at the same time, spatial contextualization, but also time contextualization, right, of the city. So going down or coming down to scale, everything started with the design of this proposal here, right? This is a zoom of this element. So this was the first element that we designed for this area, right? You can see the morphology of this axis is very urban in terms of, defining a kind of continuous facade, the idea of a street, a very classical street, if you want, with some sequence of significant buildings that emerge a little bit in height in relation with the rest of the facade, 3-4 floors, no more than that. They are not skyscrapers, but all these visual landmarks, they are located just in the crossings between this longitudinal or long element and the transversalities that crosses it, and we will discuss about them in a few slides, right? So there is this kind of crossing between the urban avenue structure and the more biophysical matrix, because all these crossing axes, they have very much to do with the biophysical matrix of the site. And then a very significant point, which is this element here, right, where the center of the new neighborhood was to be located, and then a couple of visual landmarks at the beginning and at the exit, let's say the entrance and the exit, or the other way around, of this new neighborhood. In this case, these are high-rise buildings. So everything started by designing a street. That's the idea. The first step here was to design a street. This is how. And then from there, we extended the logic of the neighborhood beyond the street itself, right? This is how the proposal was planned, right? And this is how the whole proposal looked like at the end of our work, right? Very simple, and just to mention, there are several scales here, or several dimensions. The first one is the metropolitan one. Then the super block Each one of these super blocks is around 200 per 200 meters. Cars are allowed to move around them, but they are not allowed to move inside the blocks. So everything is arranged so that cars park or enter into the parking areas from the perimeter, but there are no cars inside these super blocks, so that kind of more quiet domestic environment is created here. Commercial activities, businesses, shops, and so on, they are located at the perimeter, and only pedestrians and residents and residential uses at the ground floor level are located here. So ground floor level here is mainly commercial, more residential environment at the ground floor level is placed here, right? And this scheme is kind of repeated for the whole proposal. In this part here, the dimensions change a little bit. This is around 300 per 200, so, but mainly this is more or less the composition of the whole, the geometry, the geometrical pattern for this area. The fabric is kind of mixed. We will see later on. I mean, we didn't rely so much on this idea of zoning by, land division or, two-dimensional understanding of the city, but uses are overlapped vertically. We will see later on, except for this front here, which is very close to the motorway, right? There were some things we couldn't change, right? So this motorway is there, so we need to be aware of that. And we decided not to place residential uses close or facing this high-speed infrastructure. So offices mainly were located here, and some other industrial uses, more medium-sized, small-sized manufacturing was located here, which was in close vicinity with the airport and with some very large infrastructures, right? And then in red, public facilities that were more or less distributed homogeneously across the area, and always in relation with public space, right? You see here, I was mentioning that before, some public space access, right? So, public facilities were also, as much as possible, located all along this system of public spaces. So public facilities, public spaces, they need to work in a kind of system. That's, in our view, the skeleton of the fabric. And then the muscle, right, is the urban fabric with these, uses. So this is more or less the final layout for the proposal. And then now I will focus on some specific aspects or characteristics of this proposal. The first one has to do with this axis, right? What I was referring here, how these former, mature old villages were accessed from this motorway. The motorway runs this way, right? And then you see here that the city of El Prat today here is not today, because this is not completed, this is not fulfilled. And this roundabout or this node is completed, but the connection with the city of El Prat is not yet built. So, but once this new neighborhood will be built, the entrance to the city of El Prat will happen mainly from here. So we were very aware of the new gate effect of this point here. And we wanted to give it a kind of significance from the spatial standpoint. So what we did is to design this entrance. Then I have prepared a little video showing how the movement by driving from this motorway to the city center of El Prat, you will get a kind of a spatial experience, and we will see later on, by locating 4 high-rise buildings that they are located at the very end visually of this, not so straight trace of the road, right? You may ask yourself why this road doesn't run, straight from this point to this point, right? It seems like a little, tricky. Why you should drive this way? There is a main reason for that, which is this existing pond, right? This is an existing pond here. It acts as a kind of water reservoir, and in the regulations for the competition established and provided the tracing of this infrastructure, because this belongs to the infrastructure department or ministry nationwide at the Spanish level. So this was already approved, and this motorway crossed like this at this point over this environmental asset. We were strongly against this tracing, and we decided to go against the regulations of the competition, right? And we proposed an alternative trace for this road. This meant that we were not the winners of the competition. We were ranked second. But still today, we believe that this needed to be maintained, to be preserved. It has a strong natural value. So we decided to suggest or to propose this new tracing. And by doing that, we also wanted to provide some kind of interest, some kind of, dynamics in the approach to the mature city center here, right? And we try to do that by locating these, high-rise buildings. We will see that on a video, right? So this is how the visual components were, envisioned by us, following some theories about that. There is this book by Kevin Lynch, The American Planner, and The View from the Road. It's an analysis of the city of Boston, how it is perceived through car movement, and how, visual landmarks are located along the movement of drivers and people in general in the city of Boston. So we try to somehow reinterpret that and integrate that into our proposal. So this was the first component. Here it is explained, the proposed, entrance. There is the high-speed train station here. So the idea was to connect this roundabout with the train station, but we, as I said, suggested this alternative tracing. And then the opening of big public space here in relation with this water pond. And then some, succession or sequence of different uses activities along this promenade, right? So these were the four main components for this new entrance, right? This is what we called the civic axis, and this is how we envision or imagine this entrance to the city center, right? So this, of course, this road here is flying over the public space, which runs under this road, right? So in order to preserve some kind of continuity, movement by pedestrians, by users of this space, but also kind of biodiversity, preservation of this space, etc., right? So this was one of the first components, right? We started by defining this road, and then the crossing element, right? So at the end, it's a kind of cross, right? Second element, or maybe the most important, after the time I'm reflecting on that proposal, I think this is the most critical element, which is the phreatic or the hydrological equilibrium or balance of this area, right? This is a section, right? A geological section of this delta, right? So this delta is characterized by clay strata here, very thin one. It's around 20, 30 meters. And there is a first water reservoir at the superficial level, the first phreatic level, which is extremely polluted. all along the years, in the last, 150 years, more or less, agriculture has been very intensive here. So the permeation and the filtration of nitrates and, chemical products for that industrial activity has been drained down to the first phreatic system. So today is super highly polluted, right? It's not drinkable water anymore. It was in the past. All these, villages or settlements built on this delta area, they were taking the water from there locally by extraction, by wells, but this doesn't work anymore. So today they need to pump in water from very far away, even from other rivers in other regions of Spain, 200, 300 kilometers from here. So that makes it's totally crazy. Water is there, available. It has been there for centuries. So by this, unbalance between economic appropriation or economic exploitation of the site, there has been some environmental damage, which is the pollution of the phreatic system. So this, very well balanced ecological system, anthropic system, which is extraction of water from the underground, doesn't work anymore. So we saw that as a kind of, very critical element in the proposal. And then there is a second phreatic level, very deep down, 200 meters from surface, which is in very good, still quite good shape today. There are only some parts which are polluted, but the rest is quite healthy. It's very well maintained sweet water. But this cannot be touched, of course, right? So, what will be the impact of a new urbanized area here? Because today, this area is not built, so rainwater drains down to the first phreatic level, but it won't in the future. If we think of this, streets, asphalt, concrete surface, that's a very critical element. So this will remain polluted, even though there won't be agriculture intensive uses here on surface, but this will remain as a kind of wasted resource. So we thought it's not enough, in our case, in this case, to avoid further pollution. It's not enough by just adopting some environmental friendly elements on surface so that water is collected and taken somewhere else to be purified and give it back to the sea in better conditions. That's not enough. So we thought that our new proposal, our new neighborhood, should somehow act or function as a kind of reverse effect machine, right? So the idea is that all rainwater should be collected in buildings, in communal spaces, public spaces, and so on, being driven by following the previously existing hydrological structure. This area is full of canals, irrigation canals, and so on. So we wanted to keep them and to act as a kind of machinery for rainwater collection, and then take all the rainwater into purification ponds, right? Meaning that this rainwater is collected here, and through some very complex hydrological, I don't want to call them machineries or systems, but hydrological elements, this water should be very slowly drained down to the first level aquifer. So by the input of this clean water, after a while, after years, after decades, this first level phreatic reservoir could be compensated and purified, right? So this is very acid today, but the new water, the rainwater, is neutral. So by allowing the clean water to drain down and to mix with this polluted water, after a while, this water should be cleaned, right? This was not, of course, designed by us. In our team, we hired hydrogeologists that they knew about these systems. It's quite complex, but we provided with all the science, all the knowledge in our proposal. There was a kind of large handbook elaborating on this idea. And it was very well received by the organizers of the competition. So maybe in the future they will adopt this kind of a strategy. So this is more or less the idea. And this means that, this is the kind of detail. And here you see the whole proposal, right? The different blocks and how public spaces, which are continuous, they are kind of grid, permeating and going through all the urban fabric. They were, driving all the rainwater to the existing pond that I was referring to is located here. It could be part of this system, but also new ponds that we were, planning or designing all along these systems. This one here, this one, and this one, which is also existing here, right? So this is the water scheme, but there are also, of course, other environmental elements here, clean or renewable energy production locally, the central district heating. Maybe you are familiar with the term. It's, this kind of system that produces heat in some power stations, like this one here. In this case, we were planning to use solar energy. Of course, it's big, it's massive in our context. We are in a delta, so wind energy is also something to consider. We didn't go further into research for this wind energy, but we had the intuition that it should be explored. And maybe the most important is biomass, right? As I mentioned, we are very close to an agro park here, which is preserved. It will be there for centuries. Now it's I don't know for centuries, but in our planning system today, it's acknowledged and preserved as an agro park. So there will be a tremendous amount of biomass produced here, and we think of it as a kind of available resource in order to be reintroduced again into the economic system, and by combustion, it could provide also some heat. And then from there, it could be distributed across the neighborhood, and we create this central district heating facility or infrastructure. And then waste. Again, waste is a fundamental element, so organic waste should be collected also to these waste treatment plants, and then, be processed and maybe transformed into compost or some kind of element that could somehow establish a kind of positive energy with these agriculture activities that will happen close to the area, right? So everything is about thinking local. The idea is to, as much as possible, avoid water input from very far away. This is very expensive. This is unecological. It drains down river from other parts of the country. It takes a lot of energy to pump this water and to build this infrastructure. And so also water being obtained locally as much as possible. Energy being harvested and consumed and distributed locally. And again, waste being treated and optimized locally as well. How this is transformed into the structure of public spaces, as I said. Rather than proposing super big public spaces, monumental and so on, we were just following the traces or the tracks of previous existing hydrological structures. So all public space is based on the idea of, following existing canals, existing hydrological structures, and acknowledging and integrating into the proposal the existing ponds, right? The big metropolitan space is already there. It's the river, right? The river here. So the big metropolitan park for this area shouldn't be proposed, shouldn't be, designed from scratch, but just acknowledging and preserving the existing riverside, right? And in the shape of this river park next to the area. The only thing needed here was to acknowledge that element, those values, and integrate them into the proposal. So that's mainly the idea, right? So the structure of public spaces is no less than just acknowledging what is already there, right? And how this is transformed in terms of, also urban integration. We see here one of the first drawings we proposed in our, during the reflection. This is the existing city of El Prat. The main streets, the most successful streets in the existing urban core, are those that in the past were canals, right? During industrial times, these, on-surface water streams were conducted, were transformed into underground infrastructures, pipelines and so on, and collectors, but still on surface. The traces of these main streets were no less than these existing, water canals. So what we did is just follow them and integrate them into the new existing proposal, right? So there is a continuity between the main streets in El Prat del Llobregat and our access here, right? For instance, this is very clear, right? This is no more nor less than the previous water canal crossing the existing city of El Prat del Llobregat. The difference between here and here is that in the existing city, you cannot see the water. The water runs underground, whereas in our proposal, the water runs on surface. It's part of the environmental, or landscape, urban landscape here, right? Of course, this needs to be taken carefully. If this water is not properly purified or treated, this could be, kind of not so pleasant element. But there is technology, there is the knowledge today, as we discussed on Friday, using some kind of particular species and phyto depuration and so on. So this could be handled quite easily, I could say, right? So the continuity between the existing city and the new development, it's also something that we always aim for. It's assured by just following the logics of the territory. We don't need to invent new streets, new geometries, just following what is or what has been already there. So this is the second element, hydrology, and the third element, the urban fabric, right? Once we have this skeleton, once we have the critical elements in place, such as the Metropolitan Avenue, the entrance to the city, the hydrological skeleton or the public spaces skeleton, how to fill this skeleton with muscle, the powerhouse, in a way, of the city. What kind of fabric, what kind of architectural typology should we propose here? So again, we go back in history, right? And we analyzed the different existing fabrics. So the idea is to learn from them and integrate and make active elements of that learning into our proposal. So we took all those existing neighborhoods that we consider to be successful in terms of urban activity, successful economic urban fabric, and so on. And we analyzed them, we identified them, some, all city centers, some developments of the first half of the 20th century, some housing states that were developed here and during the 60s, 70s, these large residential areas, large housing states, and some industrial areas also. And we started by analyzing several data, such as density, dimensions, the size of the plots, as the basic element, the land partition, how big were the plots here, what kind of activities were allowed, which was the footprint of the architecture, 72% in this case, only 34 here. So we see a big gap between traditional city and new city, right? This is the newest development. the percentage of the perimeter of the plots which is built. I mean, so that perimeter is seen by us as a kind of, interface surface between the street and the public space and private space, which are buildings. So this, contact surface, which is the perimeter, it's important to assess how much of it is built, therefore providing opportunities for exchange, right? The proportion of public space, private space, and some typological values such as the deepness of the built-up area, right? So all this was codified. We extracted some kind of lessons, bearing in mind that some of these fabrics were successful, some others were not. So we decided to copy those parameters, or to reinterpret, and to give a contemporary reading or a contemporary touch to those parameters. So we learned from them, and we came up with some kind of, prototypical blocks, right? That's the idea. We decided to code in terms of urban regulations, which were the parameters to integrate. And we came up with this kind of typological reinterpretation, right? The blocks, the dimensions, what kind of activities were located at the ground floor level, at the upper levels. You see here the different parameters. They are so small, but they talk about, densities, footprints, mixture of different activities, and we treated differently the different blocks, right? Depending on their locations, depending on the demands and the role they had in the general scheme. We came up with up to 8 different prototypes, block prototypes. And we started to redistribute different schemes on how to distribute the activities. For instance, the more red, the more tertiary these areas are. They are located, as I told you before, in relation with the big motorways. These orange areas are areas where the residential component is dominant, right? But still there is some tertiary uses on it, manufacturing in yellow. So it's kind of, providing the range of activity mixture for each one of these roads, and which were to be, and this is something I will show you with the video, which were to be the most, rigid or pre-configured facades, those facades that were, designed from the very beginning, from the planning standpoint, from the first early stages of the planning process. They were drawn in a very specific way. We wanted to make sure that some of these facades could be built in the future as we imagined them, whereas some other facades in green here, they had some more, a higher level of flexibility. They could be adapted depending on the developers, right? So this is very rigidly, I could say, drawn and established in terms of urban morphology. These were kind of flexible. We will see that later on, right? And this is how we imagine the volumetry of these blocks. What I just mentioned, these existing, facades that were very, well established and defined and so on. And there were some others, mostly coincident with these inner parts of blocks where, there was some kind of domestic approach. So this, kind of architecture is lower in density. It can be changed. It's more diverse in terms of architectural typology, and so on and so forth, right? And then the phasing, how this was to be implemented. Of course, we need to give a solid, a robust technical component or technical content to this plan. So we envision that this shouldn't be developed in one step. It could be horrendous to put on the market 6,000 housing units in one step. the market couldn't possibly absorb that. So we needed to think in terms of phasing, right? So there was one phase which we consider critical to be the first. It is the starting point, let's say, right? And once we have that, there are several options. Maybe the city would develop towards this northern part, facing the big infrastructure. There was another possibility, which is the development of the city towards the west. There is a logistic area for the storage of cars here. So depending on the arrangement, economic arrangements with this owner here, maybe this part would be developed first. If not, there would be a backup plan to develop the city towards the infrastructure, and from them several options, right? This is more or less the roadmap for the development to be developed, for the new extension of the city to be developed, right? So including time as a kind of key factor, right? This is something super important in our view. And of course, each one of the phases needs to be balanced in terms of provision of public spaces, in provisions of how there must be a kind of balance so that the city does not become unequal, right? The idea is that each phase needs to be self-sufficient in terms of public facility provisions, public facilities provision, and public spaces and housing units, and there must be a balance. So it makes no sense to have all housing located in the first phase, and then second phase just tertiary uses. So there must be a kind of balance, so that if the whole process, which is a long-term process, and we need to be aware that things may happen along the process, and if everything stops, we don't end up with one area full of economic uses with no housing provision, for instance, right? That could be the whole adventure quite unbalanced, right? That doesn't make sense in a way, right? So this is more or less how we see this kind of ecological approach to, in principle, in my view, a super unecological competition. I mean, so we aimed here in providing some more sensitive elements to that kind of super big competition. What I will do here now is to share with you a video where this proposal is condensed in, I think, 10 minutes. Let's see if it's online. It's here. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So, no, it's not 10 minutes. It's 3.5 minutes, right? So this is the city center of Barcelona. So everything starts there. So this is the super big street or major street for Catalonia. So it goes out of the city and then approaches to the Delta area. So the whole proposal is expected to happen here. So it all starts with this big street or major street. It goes up. This is the whole area, public facilities in red, and then the elements of a structure, right? So first, the water, existing hydrological pattern or hydrological system. Public spaces following those water elements, public facilities, as I said, a kind of cohesive system. And then this is where the entrance to the city of El Prat is explained. A new centrality, it is said here in Catalan. So as you see, this kind of visual terminus, visual landmarks at the end of each one of these, straight lines. And as you turn, you find another one as a visual terminus. This is the existing pole I was referring to on the park running below this entrance, right? This is a shopping mall, a new commercial area, which was needed. Then the avenue. On surface, the big metropolitan flow, it's happening underground, right? And this is the, let's say, prototypical block, the construction of the block. The street, commercial uses at the ground floor level, which are fixed elements, and then offices and apartments on top of that. Some areas where architecture might be, kind of flexible. It isn't so important how these elements are defined volumetrically, both in height, but also in their position, right? So they can be moved, and depending on the development, they might be designed or established differently. So very briefly, this is the summary, the brief summary of the whole proposal. Right. So this is the first of the two competitions we were partaking in. At the end, as I said, we didn't win the competition, even though there was a big discussion. We knew about that later on within the jury. But at the end, a Dutch team was the winner of the competition, but the promoters, finally, there was a public administration promoting this competition. The promoters decided at the end not to build the winning competition. So they made kind of compromise between the winning competition and our competition, right? So, and it's still under progress since after this competition, the global crisis, the real estate and financial crisis erupted all over the planet, and it struck particularly hard in Spain. So kind of the process started in kind of a slowing down pace, and they are still working on that, and well, they are starting to build part of it, but it's slow, very slow, the process. So we will see in the future what will happen. The luckiest, happiest, I could say, thing about this is that only half a year after, we were invited to partake in this second competition, which was the development of the northern facade of the city of Vilanova i la Geltrú. We are, in this case, far away from the city of Barcelona, 50, 60 kilometers, right? So it's not in close vicinity with the city of Barcelona, but the kind of issues are kind of similar, right? It's a mature city also here, historical one, and there is this 120 hectares here at the northern part of the city with not a motorway, but a main road here running across the area. So the morphological components of this competition are quite the same. We learned some things while drafting our proposal for the El Prat del Llobregat, the previous one, right? And we wanted to, review that kind of approach and suggest some kind of improvement. So this is the second round with some, not improvements, but at least some kind of reflections from our side. So I feel happy, I feel lucky that we had the chance to test for the second time the kind of hypothesis or the kind of ideas that we envisioned for the first proposal, right? So there is a kind of evolution here. These are pictures of the two different sites so that you can feel the difference. In one side, the Prat del Llobregat, the previous proposal, the site looks like this one, a barren land, brownfields with, the presence of the motorways and so on. And this is very explicitly explained by these, motorway advertisements. So this is the kind of landscape we see here in El Prat del Llobregat. Some existing macias or traditional buildings, but not that many, right? Whereas in the case of Vilanova, the new challenge, this is the kind of landscape we found ourselves in, right? This is a, traditional dry stone walls, part of this hydrological system, some, heritage valued elements like churches and cloisters, water infrastructures, elements for water storage. So it's a kind of more delicate, not so industrialized, not so anthropic element, right, or landscape. So again, the challenge was kind of similar, but in this case, we decided to look at the city in a reverse way. The logical idea would be, okay, let's analyze what's happening inside the city and then extend that logic into the landscape, into the new location. But we decided to do it the other way around. We focused our attention to what was happening on natural space, on the rural space, right? This was our first idea. And we discovered that there is also a national park here, Parc de Olèrdola, with a castle on top of that. This is the mountain range, as I was referring before. I mean, this is the seashore, the harbor, and then the mountain range. This is around, let's say, 6 to 8 kilometers, more or less, from here to here. And this is the proper motorway. It's the continuation of the previous one we've seen. And this is the main road, right? Two different hierarchies, two different speeds, let's say. And what's happening here is quite interesting. These are agricultural fields in yellow and some informal residential settlements that happened during the second half of the 20th century, right? They are not legal. They are kind of illegal appropriations of land where people with no legalized water provision or energy provision are living, right? So we needed also to consider this as a kind of proposal, of element for the proposal. And then the seafront with some areas which are naturally protected, right? They have some natural value. And the big city in the middle. So we started by analyzing what's happening at the rural or not built land, right? And our proposal was to build some kind of natural connector between this natural park, this mountain here, and make it reach something similar to what I explained to you with the Naturban process in Barcelona, this kind of natural stripe going down from the mountain to the city. And then through our proposal, which was located here, be able to reach the seafront, this beach, which is protected, and make this beach bigger and enlarge it so that there might be, or there could be, a green corridor connecting these two very precious and valuable assets, right? So this is the main driver for the proposal. As you can see here, nothing about buildings, nothing about architecture, much more focus on natural space, on natural assets, right? So again, let's, we thought to ourselves, let's disclose the genetics of this particular landscape. What is the history of this site, and what can we learn from that in order to jump into the future, right? So this is the idea. We learn from the past in order to jump into the future, right? So we started by analyzing again the pre-industrial times. The city of Vilanova i la Geltrú, it has a medieval core. It's located here in close relation with water. In former times, all human settlements are very much related with water, by obvious reason. We need water to thrive and to live. So there were two small, urban developments, urban cores, walled by medieval walls and so on. And during industrial times, as it happened in Barcelona, there was the extension of this city, right? This is the extension of 1876. As I said, a common process all over Europe, right? The idea of a grid extending from the medieval walls, from the medieval cores, and the walls are demolished, so the city needs to expand. There was quite a wealthy businessman here, a local businessman that went to Cuba and then came back to Vilanova y la Geltrú and made a living and implemented, railway arrival to the city and so on. And he also proposed, he was the promoter of this extension. What are the components or the main elements of that extension? First one, it's very geometrically framed. It's a grid, right? Very clear, very rational. Second, is limited, right? Geographically, as it happened with the extension of Barcelona and many cities, right? Third element, public space is designed in a very clear way by means of squares, public spaces, following that kind of logic of grid, right? This is the logic behind this industrial second half of 20th century extension of cities in Europe. But the reality is quite different. After that plan, what happened is that, yes, part of the development followed that kind of a scheme of pattern. You can see here the grid and so on, but there were no boundaries, actually. The city exploded, went beyond the boundaries of the plan, both in formal ways, like here, but also, and most importantly, in informal ways, right? There was no way to control what was happening at the territorial scale, right? And the mixture of, residential areas, informal residential areas with industrial new artifacts located here. So this is what we call the explosion of the city. It happened all over Western Europe during the first half of the 20th century. So this is where we find ourselves today. This is the kind of reality we need to handle, right? And the site for the proposal is located somewhere here. So what was our proposal? Our proposal was to learn from those characteristics, both in geometry, the limits of the growing, and then the character of the public space. If in the 19th century, public space was very well defined geometrically within the urban fabric, we suggested that in the future, public space needs to be the opposite to the built space. I mean, no framing is not that public space is embedded into the urban fabric, but the other way around. It's the fabric, the urban fabric, the buildings which are embedded into the natural biophysical matrix of the territory. So it is the public space which is continuous, not the urban fabric. Here it is the urban fabric which is continuous, and then there are some islands of green space. Here, our proposal is that it should be the opposite, right? So it's the public space which is continuous, and then there are some islands, right, which are the existing fabrics. First statement. Second, we need to assume or to be aware that defining very rigid boundaries to urban extension does not make sense. We learn through experience that these limits are transcended and overpassed. So there are no clear boundaries, at least from the geometrical standpoint. I will develop a little bit on that, right? And these were the two main components. And then typological diversity. In red, our proposal, you will see here that by just identifying or analyzing the urban footprint of this development, you will see that the urban character here and here and here is quite different. So we dealt with this kind of typological diversity, right? The boundaries of the medieval city are made of stone, right? Are medieval walls that they can be removed. They are, actually, they have been. The boundaries of the industrial city are kind of, conceptual or abstract, right? They are drawn on paper, but we see through experience that they are not, in place, because the complex of urbanization is bigger than that. So these boundaries are not respected. So the boundaries that we suggest for the future, it's kind of soft boundary, so that there is not this clear, super hard distinction between the urban and the rural milieu, right? We accept the reality as it is, and we make that kind of boundary as rich, as complex as possible. The idea is that nature gets into the city through these kind of fingers of green structures that are permeating and getting into the urban fabric, right? And these boundaries, they can be as diverse as needed, right? With different characters, different identities. So at the end, our proposal was something like this. This is the final board that we suggested we submitted for the competition. Again, we went against the regulations of the competitions. The competition was very concerned about typology, what was happening inside buildings, and so on. We did that research. All that you see here drawn is not by chance. These dimensions are tested, are checked by drawing what's happening inside these areas with detail. But once we had that kind of exploration and testing, we decided to erase that information. It's a kind of a statement. What we were telling to the organizers here is that the most fundamental thing to reflect on was not the architecture itself, but the space in between buildings, right? So again, it was a kind of a statement. And again, we were ranked second for this competition. I mean, well, you need to accept that. If you are against or go against the regulations, and you are at risk of not being heard. So, but I don't complain about that. It's. I mean, luckily enough for us, we could afford that. I mean, we didn't care so much in winning the competitions, but building a kind of narrative that we were able to explain in the future and to contribute to the more, I could say, wider debate on these issues. So, and this is some kind of view. Since I'm not sure, well, maybe I can do that. I will share the screen. This is, sorry, yeah, this is the kind of landscape that we imagine for this area, right? You can see that at the bottom of the image. The logo for the motto for our proposal is Mar and Montaña, meaning sea and mountain. We tried to merge these two realities. It's also a name for a very typical Catalan food. It's a mixture of seafood and chicken with some kind of almond sauce. So we played with this name for food, and we identified particular elements such as this one, for instance, where special efforts in placing different activities and in again defining with detail which kind of volumetry was needed, and we used this again existing element, which is the Rambla. The Rambla is the most traditional public space in our tradition, Las Ramblas de Barcelona, for instance. Ramblas, it's the local name we give to water streams, right? The origin of the word is water stream. So anytime you heard about Ramblas, it means that previously, in former times, there was a water stream running through that. It is the case also of La Ramblas de Barcelona, right? So we built on that idea of La Ramblas and gave it a kind of continuity again into our proposal. And maybe the most interesting thing about this is the subdivision of the whole development into several areas, right? Into several neighborhoods. Let me jump a little bit forward into the presentation. This is how the area was conceived and divided by the competition. There was this area number 2, which was the area for residential development, and then area number 1 for industrial development or industrial neighborhood for the area. And there are 3 more sectors which were not part of the competition but were developed during the time of the competition, right? And there are a couple of interesting reflections here. First one, if the city is able to develop new neighborhoods of this size, how is it that the competition regulations are, defining this super large area to be built again in one step? We thought that this didn't make sense at all. I mean, there is a direct relation between the capacity of the city in digesting urban growth and the size of the planning sectors, right? It doesn't make sense to propose such a big new urban growth, urban extension, if the city is not able to digest that. And this has very much to do with the local economy, the capacity of local developers, and the capacity of the economic fabric of the city in digesting that. We have witnessed all over, not only Spain, I would say in whole Europe, super large developing areas that are planned under the illusion of unending growth, endless economic growth. But the fact is that after a while, they are empty spaces. I mean, you see there the streets laid down, you see there the infrastructure, but you see plenty of empty plots because the city is not able to cope with this new, urban development. We wanted to avoid that. That hinders, that kind of logic hinders, economic development, because after a while, those empty areas become burdens for municipalities. They need to maintain them. They need to provide some kind of security, urban services, and so on, even though there are no people living there. So we wanted to avoid that. So one of the actions that our strategies we suggested for the organizers were to split or divide that super large area into different sectors that should be planned, accordingly or gradually a long time, right? And these sectors, they had kind of similar size with the already ongoing urban developments, which are this one, and this one, right? So it's just adapting the size of things to the capacities of the territory, to the demands on the one side, and to the availabilities and potentialities of that particular society, that particular culture. Important to say is that these elements, they are not defined randomly, but they build upon an existing fabric or existing geometry of plots. I don't know if I have them somewhere here. There were some masías. You remember we discussed about the masías as the traditional economic unit in Catalonia, that building with some surrounding land around it that was exploited by those living in the masía. So this is the traditional structure of our rural landscape here. So each one of these neighborhoods was defined by following those masías. As simple as that, right? And in many cases, those masías were built. They are buildings existing there, like this one here, this one here, this one here, right? So we took those existing elements as opportunities for civic centers, public facilities, and we did not only keep these buildings, but also the existing roads giving access to those buildings. Like this one, this is very clear, or a net of roads giving access to this area here, right? And we were suggesting also to keep the trees all along those axes because they are part of the identity of the site, right? They are very nice trees, very old. People, they have them in mind. It's part of the collective identity of the people in Vilanova y la Geltrú. So we decided to, on the one hand, keep those buildings, and on the other, keep the roads giving access to those buildings a kind of, green spaces, right? Again, defining those kind of fingers. You see them here, right? In red, the existing trees, in red, the existing buildings, and then all along these roads, a network of public spaces permeating and, preserving somehow the identity of the site, right? As I told you, there was a kind of typological exploration. I mean, urban regulations again, how high the buildings should be, what kind of typology, either, traditional blocks with inner courtyards, the most traditional morphology of that, high density, middle density with some kind of semi-open blocks, right? As this one here, and some other open blocks, the so-called towers in the park. This is the name for this kind of developments. Very common in industrial residential Europe, right? And then some lower density in some other areas where the main typology is the detached houses, row houses, single family houses, but one next to another, right? Somehow also responding or reacting to the existing typologies close to it. So the idea is that we are decreasing density from the urban existing, the city is located here. So from high density to lower density at the end of the urban development, right? So there is a reflection on the typologies, right? There is also some kind of, reflection on the structural elements at the district scale. So there is the skeleton at the district scale, and then the skeleton at the residential, neighborhood scale here, right? Where again, facilities, as you see them here in red, are located in close vicinity or next to these green public spaces, right? And something also very important, we reflected on the morphology not only of buildings, as you see here, but also the reflection on the morphology of the non-built land, right? Non-built area, right? Spaces in between buildings. This idea of saving those spaces with no mineralization, greenery, so that rainfall is allowed to drain down from the surface to the subsoil, right? And how these spaces are connected and are defining a kind of microgrid within the urban fabric for each one of these neighborhoods. You see here that the morphology of the spaces is quite different depending on what kind of neighborhood we are located in. Final reflection, as I was mentioning before, on the subdivision or fragmentation of this new development. This layout does not exclude the possibility of developing that fast if needed. I mean, you can develop all these phases at the same time if some kind of miracle happens in terms of economic growth, but it also allows for a slow paced development, right? So it's more adaptable, more flexible, whereas here if you start developing this, you need to develop in one step, because different fragments are not, planned to be developed independently. So this was our kind of reflection. There was some kind of there was a kind of process here, learning from previous experience in El Prat del Llobregat to this proposal here. As a mode of conclusion, right? From El Prat, the name of the first proposal, to Mar en Montaña, the second one. In my view, there were three challenges that, as a conclusion, I would like to highlight here, and just one project. I always say that for us architects, there is just, at least this is the way I see it and the way I experience that personally, I'm always working on the same project, even though it, is materialized in different proposals all along my life, but it's kind of same, approach, set of concerns, and so on. So I feel like I'm, always working on the same project that at the end becomes something material or something, designed in different proposals, right? So three challenges, one project. The first challenge or the first lesson is that the project is already there, and the only thing we need to do is to find it. And is already there, and we can identify that by just making some kind of, historical research. The materials are already there. The secret, in my view, here is just to disclose which are the critical, the more substantial elements that we need just to highlight and rely on, right? It's like swimming in favor of the stream, right? It's just discovering what is the stream. First lesson. Second is the form and its limitations, especially when we are working at urban scale, where not only a space, which is huge typically, but also, most importantly, time is quite long. We need to provide to our proposal some kind of flexibility. Being very strong in defining solutions that are very particular might end in accelerated obsolescence, right? There must be some solutions, formal solutions, which are suitable for a certain time, certain period, but after a while, they become obsolete, because our demands as societies, they change very rapidly, and they change more and more rapidly. Nobody could dare to say that only half a year ago that we could be today in the situation we are now, where a big discussion about the quality of apartments and the size of apartments and how we relate each other in public space and so on, it's under big crisis, right? And I don't know what will happen in the future, but for sure something different will come up after this discussion. So we need to provide to our solutions with some kind of flexibility. So it's very important, in my opinion, to identify what are the critical elements that we need to assure, and we need to make sure that they will be built in a particular way, no matter whether they are functional or they are, related with some formal elements that we want to make sure that they will remain there no matter what happens. In this case, my take is that public spaces and public facilities, they need to be somehow warranted from the urban scale standpoint or urban scale reflection, but some others, architecture needs to be flexible. So this kind of, not prefigurative reflection is needed in my view. And then maybe the most important is that the city is not a project. The city, it's a process. So we need to integrate time in our reflection. How our proposals will be developed along time. What is the phasing? What is the pace? What is the critical size? And also, what will happen in the meantime? Because we tend to think in terms of Le Corbusierian utopian vision. I mean, like the 3.5 million inhabitant city by Le Corbusier, where everything is very nicely but at the same time very rigidly drawn, right? We need to think what happens between today and that future, because most of the times it takes a lot of time to reach to that vision, right? And there is a gap in between. We need to think what will happen in the meantime, right? In this transition time, which sometimes is quite long, right? And at the end, that vision that we had 30 years ago won't come to reality. So don't rely, I mean, my advice could be don't rely too much into utopian, very closed visions on cities. So the project, where to find it, the form and the limitation, and processual thinking are, in my view, three interesting components or three interesting issues to take into consideration when it comes to a proper ecological approach to the design of the city. Okay, this was it. We did it in 1 hour and a half. Now would be the time for questions, suggestions, or comments, feedback from your side.
Well, I have a question because like those projects are very big and you even had to review the brief and kind of change the rules of the competition in a way. I wanted to ask, how long does it take to create such a proposal?
These particular proposals I was showing you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we had a couple of months or something like that for each one of them. Something like that. We work around the clock. I mean, it's not much time, but we were, for the first proposal at the time, I think we were 18 people at the office, and I would say 3/4, 75%. I mean, 10 to 12 people were working on that proposal around the clock, I would say. So, for the second, yeah, something similar. Yeah, I mean, it's a very intense experience. I mean, but it is worth the stretch. I mean, to devote such energy at such time. Ideal.
If I could ask one question.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe I didn't get it, but I didn't see it in both proposals. But how do you cope with existing buildings? Because I saw the new development, but like I didn't see how you treat the building that are already there in those neighborhoods.
You mean this one, maybe?
Yeah, for example, but not exactly the old, like, because I assume those are some kind of monuments on the right. But I mean, like, there must be some housing or something else in those areas.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly, because I can see a lot of buildings there.
Yeah, you see here, there are some industrial buildings, both here. This is the Pirelli factory. They produce tires here for cars, for instance. And in the other case, here, there is this logistic area where they store the car parks here, imported from I don't know where, right? And they come here from the harbor, the industrial harbor, and they store them here, and then they distribute it at smaller scale. So these two activities, they are removed from here, right? They are part of the process. Actually, the process is initiated because these owners, they decide that this activity is not profitable anymore for them. So they moved away, right? So that's the starting point for the whole competition. They are quite powerful. So if they don't move, nothing would happen here. So in these two cases, it's quite clear. And then this big supermarket was, or shopping mall that was built in the late 70s was also, obsolete and of no more use here. So, and in this case, there are no more buildings, just maybe something here, which is kind of a greenhouse. So here there is not a big discussion about existing buildings. The important thing here for us is the existing hydrological structure, canals, that we were integrating into the proposal. As for the other proposal, or the other side, again, this activity here was removed, and some of these maybe it's not very well explained in the proposal, but some of these buildings which are there today and are illegal, I mean, they were informally built, they are integrated into the proposal. I don't know if it's explained. No, it's not explained in this. I don't know if in, maybe here, if we zoom in a little bit, we will see. You see some of these rows here, they are integrated into the urban fabric. They were considered, but unfortunately I don't have the graphic information here. But you see here this, strange shape here. This is because these buildings were, taken into consideration and integrated into the proposal. And some others, like this one, for instance, was already there. And this is the one that I was showing you. This one. This one, right, with this drywall here. So it was integrated into the proposal. The monastery here is kept. This messiah here, this messiah here. So these are, and this here. So in general terms, the most valuable buildings, they were kept in this proposal. Of course, there were some others that couldn't be kept, right? Because maybe they don't even have the very basic living conditions. I mean, it could take a big effort to keep them, right? Some others, like this one, they were very close to the water streams, and according to our regulations, you cannot build close to water streams because of flooding risk, right? So in these cases, this residential or informal barracks, I could say, they were removed. But I mean, it was treated, the issue was treated differently depending on many issues: environmental issues, heritage value issues, and the very same condition of the physical stock, right, of the buildings, pathologies, and so on, right. There was a study about that, but given the constraints of the time constraints for the presentation, I didn't include that information. If you are interested, I can dig in on the archives and send you the information about that. Unfortunately, it's in Catalan, but maybe graphically it's something that you might find interesting.
The reason I'm asking is because sometimes when there are these urban developments, I mean, we assume that some of the buildings, the best solution would be to remove them. But realistically speaking, there might be people living there, or there might be private businesses, and it's like hard to I'm just not sure if it's possible for the city to acquire the lands and to move them to other place, and if so, it takes, I assume, a lot of time.
Of course, it takes a lot of time, a lot of political effort, because this kind of removal, if not agreed with the residents there, creates a lot of controversy, for sure, and a lot of money. I don't know how is it in Poland, but regulations here are quite clear in compensating these people. There are two main things to consider here. In the Catalan law, if you remove the resident from an area because of an urban development, you need to comply with two conditions. First, you need to compensate economically to those residents, and there are some kind of ways to calculate that in a, I could say, quite transparent way. And it's not the developer who is deciding that amount, but court, right? So this is the first thing. And second, you also need to provide a new dwelling within the area. You cannot remove them to somewhere else, right? Part of the existing buildings or the new buildings, they need to host back all the people that was previously living in the area. Of course, there are more complex issues here to consider. Were these people living with, granted permissions, or they were there illegally? I mean, the whole issue can be very, very complex and controversial sometimes. But in general terms, I could say the rights of people living here, if they are doing in the right way and with granted permissions, are quite, I would say, preserved. Of course, the thing could be improved, but you know, rights are well considered in general terms in these conditions. But for this competition, we didn't get to that detail, right? We were asked to provide some guidelines at this point, but yeah, urban management later on in later phases handle and tackle these kind of issues. Yes. As for economic activities, it's the same thing. Once you prove that the economic activity, no matter whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or whatever, provides you with some kind of profit, this profit needs to be compensated if you're impacted by this urban development, right? And there are also ways to assess that compensation. Yeah, today we are facing a very interesting process here in Barcelona. There is a huge residential area, housing estate built in the 60s, 70s. It's a total amount of 3,000 housing units, I would say. And this neighborhood was built in a very fast way, in a very fast pace, and with no sufficient technical conditions, and materials were cheap and so on. And after the years, this housing stock has ended its life cycle, right? So today there is no sufficient thermal insulation. There is what we call energetic or energy poverty, and the living standards are not very good as well in terms of surface and so on. So there will be in the future, in the coming years, regeneration of that area. Should that happen only 10 years ago, the idea in some cases would be to remove part of the housing stock and build something new, right? And this is not this has happened here in the city of Barcelona, but also in many cities in Europe. I can recall here the experience of, I don't know, Bijmemer in Amsterdam, or all the housing estates in France. The policy there during the 80s, 90s were just to demolish and build something new. But this is very expensive, and this is socially very costly as well. So today the trend is to try to refurbish, retrofit, and or regenerate the existing housing stock. And the interesting condition right now is how to make that possible technically, how these buildings their structural systems starting from the very basic, the structural system would be able to cope with an increase of floor area in some cases, because much of what is happening there is just extending the surface of the apartment to the outside by means of building double facades or new balconies and so on. But that means an overload in the structural system. So starting from that, but also what will happen at the urban scale if you change the whole, urban landscape appearance of those buildings. I mean, it's a super big challenge, right? And this is something that is starting right now here in the city. I'm involved in that process, and we'll see what happens in the next couple or 3 years. There is a very interesting experience by Lacaton and Basal. You know this office in France?
No.
No? Let me show you. I'm still sharing my screen, right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so yes. This, if you're interested, there is this book by Lacaton and Basal. It's a super interesting book. These guys, they did exactly this thing 10 years ago in France. So the idea is to rethink about ways of living in the existing city and improve. Let me see, there is something here that can explain that clearly. You see the typical large housing estate. So there is a big reflection about the housing unit, the facades, how to change the appearance and the relation with the outside. Big, typological reflection, building materials, and how to expand the housing unit, right? There should be an image showing the before and the after. Everything is about, well, not everything, but much of it is about, extending the surface of the housing unit, which typically they are very tiny, very, very small. So, provide larger, living conditions, and how this, is built at the architectural level, at the, how to improve the, vertical connections, facades, eco-efficiency, thermal efficiency, energy efficiency of these buildings. But just let me, reflections on the typology, but I just wanted to show you the before and the after at the architectural scale, how this is perceived from the outside. You see before and after, right? So everything now, it's about recycling, not just demolishing and renewal. The name for that could be urban renewal. When you heard of urban renewal, you need to think about demolition processes. So today is not about urban renewal, but about urban regeneration. That's the goal in the future. Of course, it's much more complex. You need to get to an agreement with, complex residential communities here, local communities here. You can imagine how to make all these people sit around the same table and get to an agreement. Who pays for that? What kind of actions are what kind of actions are implemented? So it takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, right? And governance knowing. So we'll see. This is, in some cases, some of these experiences are already built, some others are not, and we are facing kind of similar process right now in Barcelona in the coming, 10 years maybe. But the reflection, the project should be drafted in the next 2-3 years. So if you're interested, this is a very nice book dealing with these aspects.
Are those the architects that they won the Mies Award?
Mies Award, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but maybe they have. I don't know. Let me check. Looks like. Yes, 2019.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you see here some images of this. Yeah, the before and after.
Yeah, I know this one.
Mm-hmm. You can feel the difference, right? So, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question properly.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Good, perfect. Okay. So, anything else you would like to ask? Okay, so I could suggest to take a break now, let's say 20 minutes, so that you can prepare your presentations. I think I've talked enough today. So after the break, I would like to listen to you on what you have learned from that data bank site and how you plan to integrate these green-blue infrastructures into your proposal. Okay?
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, talk to you in a while. Bye-bye.
Thank you, see you.
See you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.